As AI becomes better and better, ultimately what it means is that you need less and less data to do what it is you want it to do.
What seemed unimaginable a few years ago is now possible because AI is becoming cheaper and more accessible to any entrepreneur. Unlocking your data and building point solutions are the key.
Data is expensive if you have to go and acquire it, but if you can actually generate it yourself or within a process of generating it yourself, it can be a lot less expensive.
By focusing on high-value, repeating business problems, you can leverage AI's predictive capabilities to solve any use case.
Not only could we predict when they would stay or leave, we could also predict the best intervention methods to actually prevent them from leaving. So we could tell a business, your employee is going to leave in the next 4 months, and based on how much you want to spend, here is the top 5 ways you can use to retain that employee.
This is episode 30, and our guest is Tyler Hochman, CEO of FORE Enterprise. We're discussing how you can take control of AI's predictive power. This episode is a roadmap for product teams and entrepreneurs looking to unlock their data's disruptive potential. In this episode, we cover the focus on AI's immense data structuring capabilities, hacks to get the data needed to train your model, why entrepreneurs should focus on building point solutions, that AI can predict when you'll quit your job and how to keep you, how data privacy is becoming a major differentiator of workplaces, and how OpenAI collected so much data to train their model.
We start to see it with like Amazon and some of these very large tech firms where employees were actually deterred from working at that business as a result of their data collection policies and went to a different tech firm that promised different data collection policies.
Tyler Hochman is the founder and CEO of FORE Enterprise, an AI workforce analytics platform that predicts which employees plan to leave their jobs and recommends strategies for retention. Hochman, who was recently acknowledged on Forbes 30 Under 30 list for social impact, is at the forefront of AI innovation. Prior to founding FORE Enterprise, Tyler founded multiple consumer and B2B apps and companies such as TH Analytics, Vela, Modern Memoir, and SafeStop. Tyler holds a Bachelor's of Science in Management Science and Engineering from Stanford, with a focus on data science and finance. Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it's transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. It's designofai.substack.com.
Welcome, Tyler. We've just been chatting. So you talked about these data pipelines. You talked about collecting all kinds of information and coming up with all kinds of solutions. Now, this is really interesting to us because one of our top episodes ever was Spotify's data guru. He came in and told us that a lot of the assumptions we had about AI were wrong, that there's certain ways to use it to process and analyze data that perhaps we've been getting incorrect. What's your philosophy to data pipelines and what AI can do for us?
Yeah, I think AI is a tool in a toolbox that means that it's only as good as you make it. A lot of people potentially miss the mark on that because they search for it as a one-stop-all solution. And there's a lot that goes into what we consider AI, what powers AI. And FORE, which I founded and am the CEO of, is a great example of we created a tool about 3 years ago that was a workforce analytics solution that was predictive of telling employers exactly when their employees would turn over, even often before those employees themselves knew it. What was interesting about it is we made this really cool tool, and then we realized that we would go to businesses, they'd be like, we want the tool, amazing. In order to power the tool, we need certain access to certain data internally that the business has. For most of the businesses, and I'm talking 90% of them, they did not have the right data infrastructure and data architecture to just give us the data necessary to power that tool. So then what we ended up doing is we ended up being like, okay, well, we'll build that for you. That way we can get to the tool. And after we did it time and time again, we realized, wow, most people want AIify their business. That's a big mission-driven obligation that businesses are facing right now, but they actually don't have the correct data architecture and infrastructure necessary to do that. And so that's how we swam a little bit downstream and started building that for businesses. And then once that's developed correctly, there's a whole host of amazing things you can build on top of it that are cutting edge and super cool. But the foundation, which I think, isn't necessarily talked about a lot, is like this really sophisticated architecture.
A lot of the people in this world are not operating at the enterprise level. They're not really using first-party data in the ways that they probably could. They probably haven't structured in the right ways. What is it that Fortune, 500 or Fortune 100 companies can do that the next 2000 can't, but might be able to do soon?
Their internal data is large enough to train a lot of what they need in terms of the tools they're creating. That isn't true right now on a individual basis, or even on like a Fortune 2000, or potentially on a Fortune 2000. What's interesting is as AI becomes better and better, ultimately what it means is that you need less and less data to do what it is you want it to do. That's one of the ways I associate AI becoming better with. And so eventually what that will mean is even on the individual level, you can make AI very useful for you. And it already is. If you go to ChatGPT, it already can tune itself a little bit to the way you ask questions and what type of answers you want. And that's solely based on, by the way, the open source data they have, and then your interaction with the tool. But as the tool gets better, you need to interact with the tool less and less and less for it to know exactly how you think and how you do. That's what I associate AI getting better with. And the differences that I see between a Fortune 500 company that has access to a ton of internal data and also the cash flow to support it, right? And this is a big thing I talk about, which is it's expensive. And I think that companies don't think about that. Like, it is expensive to set up a proper data architecture to actually make it useful for your customers and for your business. And so Fortune 500 companies have the cash flow to support it, and then they have the data to actually make it useful.
And what's the internal capability you're finding these clients are lacking to be able to know how to find the right point solution? How can you get them closer to reality, and what should they be doing in the prep work to be able to get closer to what's achievable?
Yeah, it's defining your problem well. It's defining the inefficiency. You may say, oh, my labor is too expensive, as an example, and I just need to reduce my labor cost. Why don't we use AI, right? AI sounds great. You haven't really defined why is your labor expensive? Where is the inefficiency existing? If you added AI, what would the efficiency boost be? Is the problem actually good for AI, right? Is it repeatable and is it repetitive? And if you have defined all those things, like a business like mine is more than happy to help. That's when we can come in, and the clients that we work best with have that answer at the beginning. They say, my problem costs X amount to me on an annual basis. This is the nature of the problem. This is how often the problem occurs. And then we can say, amazing, it's going to cost Y to build your solution. The efficiency that we think you're going to be gaining is Z, and you're going to be able to recoup your investment in months, weeks, years. Then everyone has an even playing field of information, and you can make that judgment decision from there, as opposed to, oh yeah, you spend too much on people or you spend too much on goods. I'm just going to throw a technology at you and it's going to solve your problems. Like that, that never works.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it's transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps us if you leave reviews. Go to designof.ai to share your AI product recommendations and product ratings.
Let's go to the top here. Use cases, benefits. These groups that are investing heavily today have the right architecture. What are they able to do today? What is it that perhaps we haven't heard about? Because we just keep hearing this whole AIFI, data. What's actually happening at the boots in the ground and the executives in the boardrooms?
I can talk through a number of use cases that our pipelines have been used for. The first one I was mentioning earlier is workforce analytics. And so the HR space was typically and historically not necessarily a space that's had a lot of data revolution, so to speak. One of the ways that we started is we were actually able to use a combination of internal data, only internal data that employees knew was already being tracked, so there was no data privacy concerns, and then external data, and actually then predict which employees would stay or leave at that business over certain timeframes. What that also meant is that we could predict it for teams, we could predict it for departments, and that was really cool. Is not only could we predict when they would stay or leave, we could also predict the best intervention methods to actually prevent them from leaving. So we could tell a business, your employee is going to leave in the next 4 months, and based on how much you want to spend, here is the top 5 ways you can use to retain that employee. So that's like a pretty cool use case and had a lot of traction. Another one that we built for a client was a AI fashion stylist. Imagine every day is your red carpet moment and you want to go and access a stylist that is typically very expensive with information that you provide in conjunction with kind of a scraping of fashion data across the web. We can actually start to associate outfits for you and predict based on your personality what type of outfits and what type of looks you want to wear. Another use case we did is we can't name the sport or the sports team, but holistically we work with sports franchises in order to do prediction and detection for everything from, and generally we use video analytics. So you record practices and games and those things, and then you use AI-enabled tools to identify scouting when you're trying to scout for a potential player that could fit well in your team, or actual real-time analytics, and you're trying to help a player adjust the way they're performing. So that's been a really cool application of the data pipelines that we built.
I know our audience are generally people who are either building tools or working for groups that are trying to leverage these technologies. And a lot of what you're talking about sounds similar to the big data revolution that happened 8-10 years ago. What's different this time? Is it just that there's more horsepower, or is there something significant that's happened?
When people talk about AI, what I think currently the best use case for true AI is actually sorting and structuring data. And it's not very jazzy, it's not very sexy, but essentially when you get unstructured data and you need to make it structured to then go and power one of these tools, AI is very good at that. It's very good at mapping between unstructured and structured, and then literally changing it to be in the form that you need it to be in. And that's what I would say is different most recently, is that ability to do that has gotten incredibly strong. You have all these really cool advancements coming up between agentic AI and all these different things that I do think will revolutionize. AI also faces a lot of challenges. There's hallucinations, there's all these different things that people talk about all the time. So in terms of what you can count on it, almost 100% of the time to deliver very well is, I believe, this structuring and formatting. And then we will get to all that really cool stuff.
So the news headlines are dominated by Anthropic and OpenAI, and these groups are building these models. Now, do you see that the future will be dominated by those models, or will enterprises be building their own models on top of those using pipelines like yours?
It's such a cool time because, you had massively funded AI-driven businesses, and then you just had, I'm sure you're familiar with, like the DeepSeek, these companies that have been able to come out and do it, significantly undercutting the cost and building really efficient LLMs, almost as point solutions. Depends on how far you're talking down the lane. Eventually, do I think there'll be kind of these incredibly large LLMs or multiple LLMs that are able to really accurately answer all these questions that we're asking? Yes, I do believe that. Now, that might be, though, a while away. What I think will be coming out soon are actually point solutions. And to your point, they're LLMs or different forms of models that are trained specifically to address points of enterprises or points of consumer needs, and not so holistically, ask me any type of question.
Okay, well, let's go zoom in on some of these use cases. Let's start with the sports analytics one. It's the one that's the hardest to understand because there's so many variables in it. There's talent, there's luck, there's all these features in there. How do I convert this massive data set into an answer that's reliable? What is it that's happening under the hood in the case of your pipeline here?
It's a multi-factor approach. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. And a lot of it is actually translating what has made that franchise successful into and teaching it to the AI, right? And so teaching the AI what to look out for. And that's actually a cool part of AI. There's a really cool opportunity to take knowledge, institutional knowledge, and in this case with the sports team, what has allowed that sports team to be successful, what their differentiator is, and actually teach that to an AI, and then allow the AI to identify, using that knowledge, what players, what teams are the best composed, or what players have the most upside potential. That's where I think it is right now. It is a point solution that is translating already existing knowledge, but now allowing you to apply that knowledge to a huge data set, as opposed to saying, oh, give me the best player all the time. I think it's too broad of a question to ask AI right now without teaching it first. Eventually, are you going to be able to do that? Maybe when there is enough training data, and we have been doing this for so long, and the AI itself has learned all the different ways that every team thinks about a player, that you could just ask it a question and it'll produce those types of answers. But for now, at least, what I think is really cool is you will teach it your differentiator, and then you will let it apply itself to a broad data set.
The capability today is to take a very large, potentially decentralized data set and turn it into core insights and actions that basically convert your IP into tactics, which is really fascinating. And if I think of the insurance industry, there's tons of applications. I think of medical, there's tons of applications. But when we're thinking about smaller builders, ones who are building quite literal point products, what can I do with this? How do I start on this? Because what was possible 2 years ago has totally changed. Many people might not even know what's possible. So how do I even know what's possible? And how do I even know where to start building something on top of this capability?
Yeah, there's different approaches. If you're a small builder, so let's assume you have limited cash to build something like this, because your main concern is going to be, how do I acquire the data necessary to train what it is that I want to build? What's cool now and will continue to be cool in the future is that open source data is becoming larger and larger. As an interesting example, OpenAI, and it's very controversial right now, but came into the market as a charity. They came in as a nonprofit. And so it actually motivated a lot of people to give up their data because they're like, oh, you're not going to ever generate a profit from this. So I'm more than happy to give my data functionally for free because you're a nonprofit. Now they're pivoting and they're charging some very large contracts. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of controversy around that. They, even as a big business that was well-funded, identified this problem early on, which is it's expensive to get the data. And so as you're thinking about the solution and developing this as a solo entrepreneur or on a very small team, your first question needs to be, how am I going to get the data and how am I going to do it within my budget? And you may have to sacrifice a little bit of the accuracy of the algorithm in order to get the data. That being said, if you have a very specific point solution, you may be able to refine your problem set enough to then be able to offset that sacrifice in volume of data for type of data and hyper-specific amounts of data. So let me give you a great example. Say you were trying to develop an algorithm to predict the best stand at the farmer's market, right? And you wanted to learn, based on all these input variables, what is the best type of food or cuisine that's going to perform well in the farmer's market. The easiest, lowest cost way to do it, to actually develop a proprietary data set, would be go to your farmer's market and survey every single person with basic questions. How well are you doing? What is it you do? What type of food it is? What vegetable do you sell? And do it for like a couple months. And then you create your own data set that you didn't have to pay for that actually can have a lot of valuable insights. That's the crudest example I can give, but I actually think a very important one, which is, although the challenge of accessing data and data being expensive is a real one, there are kind of low code or low cost ways to go and acquire that data. It's a blending of manual labor, which you never associate with AI, and then actually using AI on top of it.
You mentioned earlier one of the use cases you built for is this personal stylist. Can you walk us through the trade-offs there? Because when I think of fashion, subjective. I can't think of hard data that I could use to inform those decisions, but clearly you've cracked this nut. Can you talk us through what the trade-offs might be and how the data might be leveraged to do something that is typically rather subjective?
Fashion still is subjective. A big part of the process that we built is actually understanding the person being styled. And there is a huge component of this where we do a whole quiz and we actually ask that person questions about their fashion taste, what they like. What we can compare that to is trending fashion trends that are coming out, right? And so there definitely is a mainstream, sub-mainstream, different versions of trends for fashion. And so what we can do is kind of objectively begin to define those trends and then correlate those with your preferences. And then on a quarterly basis, very similar to how fashion is produced right now, right? It is, quarterly or seasonally. You can then correlate your personality with the projected future trends and actually start to style someone in line with what would be considered fashionable during the season.
Again, focusing on these smaller builders, if you're building a solution like this, where we know the data will have higher quality and accuracy as we move forward, what types of developments or what types of steps can you take as a builder to improve the outputs of your solution?
I'm so happy you asked that question because the company we started with this was a startup when we started with them. They are and will continue to grow very large, but we had this problem, right? It's like, how do you actually get interesting insights? Vogue is not offering up their insights. And speaking to what I spoke about earlier, you have brands that have a lot of IP. And so using Vogue as an example, it would actually be not incredibly difficult to work with them and translate their IP, which is the institutional knowledge they have and how they define fashion trends and what's going to come out, and build an AI on top of that. But working with a much smaller brand, we don't have access to that institutional knowledge. So we had to figure out ways to get this type of training data to get information about how people view fashion without having to spend a lot of money. And ultimately what we did was quizzes. We literally took the friends and family and whoever do it pool of people and ask them questions about how they engage with fashion. What do they think about fashion? What's their personality like? What do they like to be styled in? All these different things. And so for very little money, we were actually able to create a training set that we then use to train the model. And I think a really good example that data is expensive if you have to go and acquire it, but if you can actually generate it yourself or within a process of generating it yourself, it can be a lot less expensive.
As you mentioned this whole idea of quizzes, I think about the early online dating sites where they're very quiz-based. What innovations have happened in that space? Because there's a lot of data going back and forth in these dating sites. What are they able to do in terms of matching today that perhaps 10 years ago they couldn't?
It's funny, yeah. So I actually started an app called Vela, and ultimately transitioned a little bit more to the personality wellness space. But it began as a dating app. And the assumption we had is that individuals create a massive digital footprint, even based off the Netflix shows you watch and the Postmates orders you do and all these different things. You're actually creating more and more data as we just are people who interact with the internet more and more. And so we thought if we digested that data on an individual basis, we might actually be able to understand people really well and then pair them, because a lot of synergy we see comes from, oh, you watch that Netflix show, I watch this Netflix show. Oh, you eat at this restaurant, I eat at this restaurant. You generally find relationships work with commonality. We found a lot of success there. That being said, I think the dating space is very saturated and it's tough to start an app there. So we ultimately pivoted into the personality wellness space. But that being said, we realized that, yes, there's a huge opportunity for using big data to understand people to a level that was never understood before, and then use AI, train it on that data to then match people to a really high degree of accuracy.
Now, what you're talking about, it all sounds wonderful, sounds great, but I can imagine there's a lot of flaws in a quiz-based model. What needs to happen for us to move beyond quizzes to find a way to intersect these data sets and collect this data and these signals on an ongoing basis? What are the next kind of plateaus in the technology need to happen?
Well, it's funny. So Velo wasn't a quiz-based model. We actually only used your function, your social media, your video media, that data. There was no bias. And I think that's the problem with a quiz-based model, is that there's an implicit bias. If you ask me to rate myself on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to tell you a 10, probably, not particularly accurate, but it's just what I'm going to say because of the inherent bias, which is so true whenever it is you're talking about yourself. So what we used is we actually digested directly from these sources your data. So you interact with your Netflix in the truest capacity that will represent yourself. And to your question, I think it brings up a really interesting debate, because the best way to not have to use quizzes to understand users is to just see it how they truly interact with tools, right? Like the internet and their different accounts and so on and so forth. It gets into really large privacy concerns, very valid, very genuine privacy concerns, where we thought was interesting. There are some startups doing this. I think it's a really cool opportunity, is the value of your data users should understand and be able to monetize. And by the way, businesses do it already, right? Every single one of these large tech companies are monetizing your data. So I believe that the user should actually be the one given the choice. And you can either say, listen, you can't monetize my data, in which case no more tracking, you can't mine my cookies, whatever you want to do. Or you have a portal and you connect all your different accounts to it. And then those companies charge the portal. I mean, I'm kind of giving a great business idea. I've always thought it was a good one. Those companies charge the portal and that generates income for you. And now you are literally an income generating contributor just by being on the internet and just by interacting with the internet. And so I've always believed that.
That sounds a lot like some of the potential promises of Web3, where you're a tokenized entity and you have rev shares across the world. Why did it fail? Why is this not happening? Why are we giving everything away for free?
there's a certain level of one, like sophistication that's necessary to execute that. For better or for worse, a lot of people don't necessarily understand its implications. And then the second one, I think, is there's no incentive for large businesses to do it. There's no movement that says, I'm not going to use Netflix anymore if Netflix gives out my data. And that, again, comes to the level of sophistication of understanding what's actually being happening behind the scenes. But going back to what's cool about AI and about like education AI example, which I'm a huge champion of, is that's democratizing access to education. And now I can learn not to the highest level of education, but to a higher level from lessons and courses and all these things. And as a result of that, better understand my position as it relates to these tech companies, data in general. And that'll continue over time. And I do think eventually we will get there. But yeah, right now, there's just not enough pressure for big businesses to do it.
It sounds like there's some big questions, big, conceptual ideas here. But when we think of architecture, we hinted at this idea of a mesh network, which was something that was pushed pretty heavily 5 to 10 years ago. This idea that I will do part of the task for you and I hand it off to someone else and hand it off to someone else and hand it off to someone else, and everyone collects a portion of the income and the cost. Now, when we think of AI, it is a fully centralized model. It's an oligarchy, really. What happened? How did we go from this really utopian idea that we're all going to share the internet to this one where, oh, well, it's just these 10 companies in charge of everything?
I think so I don't want to just continually kind of criticize their approach. That being said, OpenAI were smart and they took this approach from that utopian belief in beginning this as a nonprofit, beginning this from and very strategically a charitable standpoint. And I think because people were within those lines, they were thinking that way. And so in theory, they executed as a true nonprofit could give us that, right? Like they are a tool, although a centralized tool, a tool for everyone. And theoretically, you could both upload and their algorithms are trained, but also download data from them, right? So it's kind of creating the truest open source internet that could have existed. It didn't come true. We found out that it's not what we thought it was going to be. As a result of that, I think it's actually carried through with a number of different businesses that have now seen that people will pay for it, irrespective of whether or not that they are getting anything truly in return that they should be getting. And as a result of that, yeah, that's how we ended up where we are. You normally see swings with this type of stuff. So what we could see potentially is as it becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to build these large language models, there's actually a swing back to people wanting a more utopian approach to this and wanting to own what it is that they contribute to the system, and then the system pays them for it. Yeah. And I do think DeepSeek was a great example of that. Like, I mean, it's like $5 million. They were able to create a multiple LLMs that performed very similarly. And so I think we are getting a little bit more of that direction. But yeah, that's how I think the problem got created.
So let's ground it back in business realities. Obviously, the enterprises have mountains of data. They have so much computing power available to them. They have the budget. They have the need. When we're dealing with SMBs, let's talk a normal 1,000-person company. What do they have access to today? Because when we're thinking about this model that all the power is centralized at the top, it seems like they would be at a huge disadvantage. They don't have as much first-party data. They don't have the talent internally to really build out the architecture necessary. What can these businesses do? What do they have access to? Just help me imagine that there's a path forward for them.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is they should really analyze, and we use the acronym like it's a terrible acronym, but it goes to how we look at problems that are ripe for AI disruption, which is it expensive? Is it repeatable? And is it repetitive? Those are the three things I think you need to be thinking about when you go and actually look at applying AI to a specific solution or a specific problem. And so what I think those businesses should first do is first actually analyze what is it that I'm trying to use AI to solve? And is it expensive, repeatable, and repetitive? Expensive meaning, is the inefficiency that AI is then going to generate more efficiency for really expensive to me? And as a great example, you can see businesses that classically want to use a chatbot, right, as a support help agent, and then as a result of that, they can hire less support agents or make their support agents more efficient and save money that way. Now, to set up a quality chat agent for a business is not a trivial investment. You're still in the hundreds of thousands of dollars minimally. And again, that's a quality one. You can do non-quality ones, in my opinion, for way less. But a true quality one is that you want to actually replace or really enhance a support agent is about that amount. And so you've got to look at your cash basis and say, okay, if I'm going to only get a 20% boost in efficiency from this AI tool, pay all my support agents $1 million a year. That's $200,000 at a maximum efficiency boost. Now, and it's going to take me, call it between $200,000 and $300,000 to build the tool. So it's going to take me at minimum a year, if not multiple years, to recoup my investment. You may say that's worth it. You may say, yes, I have the cash flow that can support that, in which case the problem is now expensive enough. The support agent one is a great example because it is definitely repeatable, right? You have the same people coming back. It's the same task every time, right? Go to a support agent and ask, how do I navigate this bug? How do I do this certain thing? So it's repeatable and it's repetitive. They're asking the same type of questions every single time. And so that's a great example. It's expensive enough where a business could very easily go and take a open source solution. You've got a variety of them, and then train it on their exact data, right? They've got a ton of data that is how do their customers interact with their support. And if they don't, the first thing they should do is start recording that data. Or as this example, how your customers actually are interacting with your support agents. Get the transcriptions, get the whole thing, feed it to the LLM, and now you have a very solid chat agent to now increase the efficiency of your support agents that solves for an expensive problem, a repeatable problem, and a repetitive problem. And so that's kind of the analysis I would use. That means that AI may not always be right. And that's where a big thing that we tell clients we work with is actually we tell them not to use it. We're like, it's good and it definitely gets you a long way, but it is expensive and it has to be associated with certain problems right now. It's going to get better and it's going to get less expensive, but don't feel the need to jump in just because it is such a sexy field right now.
One of the big questions that I have when I talk to people about this is whether you should augment it or automate it. Now, to automate requires a lot of faith. You're basically just handing the keys over. But when I hear of a complex web of services and agents and such, I sometimes wonder whether we should use the AI to coach people, to support them, add the context necessary. How do you approach that decision of whether to automate or augment?
I would say I probably lean more with you on augment. I generally feel that in order to automate, not to say automation is impossible, but going back to what I was talking about earlier, it would be extremely expensive. And the efficiency that you were trying to get, you might eventually achieve, but will take so long to recoup your investment that you're like, what was actually the point by the end of the day? I mean, it took me 5-10 years to actually recoup this investment. Augmenting allows for a human to be more efficient, which I think is what most good tools do. In the same way that as all these different technological discoveries keep coming about, we really don't have very many solutions that fully automate anything in a very candid way. You have certain robotics companies that one of them have actually invested in, Figure AI, and they are actually automating some of the warehouse type labor solutions in a fully automatable way. I mean, it's a robot doing it. Outside of that, really is, I think, best used as an augmentation solution.
You brought up labor. Now, at the beginning, you're mentioning that one of the use cases that you're getting the most traction in is workforce analytics. That seems to be an area where there's a clear ROI. Businesses are focused on profitability, and as a result of it, they care about productivity. And we just talked about automation. Can you walk us through what your solution can do? How does it understand what people are going to do?
Yeah, so we digest all different types of data coming from internally. Generally, the biggest indicators, although we take a ton of different types, are schedule adherence and utilization from internal data sources. Then we pair that with everything from census information to demographic information to location-based information. And holistically, that forms a dashboard in which you see everyone and they're listed on a very low, medium, high, and very high likelihood of turning over a set time range. And then that triggers an alert to the employer. They see the employees that are starting at the very high or high range. And then as an employee may move from medium or medium high to high or very high, it triggers an alert to the employer. And then once they click in, they can actually see, because we've also trained the model on the ways that that employer has tried to intervene to prevent that turnover. And so they can actually see the effectiveness of their different intervention strategies, and then which intervention strategy will be most effective to preventing that employee from turning over.
And is that type of analytic solution happening today in factory type settings, or is it happening in regular office settings?
Yeah, it's pretty industry agnostic. We work with healthcare institutions. We work with large financial firms. We do work with, industry factory settings. So you mainly need, at the very minimum, above 100 employees all doing relatively the same thing. Because we're going to train it holistically on that data wherever that exists. As an example, in healthcare, there's a huge problem with nurse turnover. We really honed in on nurses specifically, as opposed to any other kind of medical profession. And we're able to predict that very accurately. In financial firms, you have analyst turnover. And so we honed in on analysts. In factories, you have turnover of specific groupings of people that are responsible for a specific piece or part of a production line.
I'm sure a lot of people listening are imagining that it can't be very accurate. So tell me, what's it getting right? What's it not always getting right?
It is shockingly accurate depending on the time range you set and depending on how much data you're willing to feed. We actually had a product, we don't typically use it anymore, that was solely publicly trained. And that got us, on a team composition. So if you look over, call it anywhere between like 25, I believe, and 100 people per team, it would be able to predict the turnover rate of that team very well. On an individual basis, it struggled, but again, it was only trained on publicly available information on the company, number of employees, all that type of stuff. When you supply it more internal data, using a really good example here, your schedule adherence. So how often do you perform tasks in your business? Everything from when do you start your day, when do you end your day, when do you perform your first task, when do you perform your last task, when do you take lunch, all those things, and then you track them over time, form deviations. And as those deviations occur, in a repeatable manner or in a certain analyzable manner, it's actually very accurate, up to about 3 to 6 months to predict with that indicator along with a bunch of other ones. I think we got to like a 92% confidence interval on whether or not someone would stay or leave the business.
And what data is missing for this type of solution to be useful in other types of corporate settings where you have marketers and you have writers and you have devs? Because there's a lot more nuance from role to role.
Yeah, the roles where KPIs are most standardly tracked are the roles in which it's most useful, as well as when there's a lot of people who do that role. If you work with too small a business, there won't be enough people. And if you go up the vertical chain of command at a business, the pools of people slim down and it becomes harder and harder to do. And so you're looking for generally the base or one level above the base at a big enough firm where there's at least 100 people performing that task and good KPIs that are tracking their performance.
It seems like the same theme running through everything, which is AI is great at processing these big batches of data, but it has to be homogeneous in some form where the variance is very focused on some core KPI-centric things so you can associate them. Now, we're introducing this whole multimodal component, computer vision, and agents that can take screenshots of everything you're doing. Microsoft launched a tool like that with a lot of pushback. OpenAI launched one, Anthropic launched one. What's the future of workforce management now that these tools can actually monitor what you're doing all the time?
It's a very interesting data privacy problem. Again, people have to realize what the problem is first. We are just becoming more educated on, first, the technology gets invented. No one really knows what it's fully capable of. We learn what it's fully capable of, and then we can form our opinion on it. And so people are still forming their opinions on it, and most of them are quickly. Ultimately, I think it's actually going to become something that's very important as part of an initial onboarding, or when you're thinking of joining a business. There will actually be large differentiators from business to business that might actually attract you to one or another. You will learn what businesses collect, and that may literally inform your desire to go to that business. And I actually think we start to see it with like Amazon, and some of these very large tech firms where there are a number of employees who, and the labor market's interesting right now, so not particularly right now, but a little bit before right now, where employees were actually deterred from working at that business as a result of their data collection policies and went to a different tech firm that promised different data collection policies. It's going to be a very interesting negotiating point almost in the beginning of when you're hiring people as people become more educated on it. And it also will correlate with labor markets. As the labor market gets tighter, you have more negotiating power. And then when there's a surplus of labor, you obviously lose that. It's going to be really interesting when you argue or when you talk about and negotiate for salary and benefits. It may literally be right next to healthcare, right? Like right next to dental plan is what data are you collecting while I work?
Yeah. Not to say that employers are going to do it, but it's quite plausible that they would know everything you do on your screen. If you've authorized them to, and you might have done that in your contract without recognizing it, they would know everything you're doing, how much time you're spending on any app. Is that accurate?
They have that capability if they wanted to.
And hypothetically, what could you do with that information if you knew that 30% of the time they were sidetracked on social or 20% of the time they're on LinkedIn? Are there correlations you could start making with that kind of information?
As it relates to the workforce analytics, we already have enough based on just the normal KPIs that people know are being tracked to do pretty cool prediction stuff. I guess where it will be interesting is jobs where they are expensive is the wrong word, but they are jobs with very high salaries, let's say. You could essentially optimize someone's performance to an extremely high level. And if you are paying them so much money, each incremental percentage of optimization may actually correlate with a lot of dollars spent, or they're a big revenue generating person. And then you can apply that same logic to large groupings of people, right? So instead of it being one person, now at the same expense, but over 100 people, and so if you can move it up by 1% of efficiency, you're actually gaining a lot of either revenue or decreasing a lot of cost. I think there's definitely opportunity. That being said, I do think there's a lot we can do right now with just the KPIs that people know are being tracked.
One of the topics we go on a lot about here is the difference between output versus quality. And it's really hard to define a high performer who might slack off 30% of the time versus someone who's always on the job, but the quality of the work is pretty poor. What can we do to understand what good means? Because I know when we talk to designers, it's really, really hard to know what it means. You can associate to what the regression to the mean of what past work has been, but it's hard to predict what good will mean in the future. Are there tools, are there capabilities now to make those associations?
There are tools that can analyze large amounts of data faster and better than before. What you can do with those is you can now start to define good or a good performer in a way where you couldn't before because you just couldn't do those type of computations. It's too much data. So what we like to do actually is, certain clients wanted, let's say, a productivity score. But what we'd have to do is we'd work in depth with them to understand the institutional knowledge, and going back to what we were talking about earlier, of what they defined as, it's subjective, right? It's on a business by business case. And so what they defined as a good employee, and then we could train the algorithm to learn that and then recognize that across a ton of data. And so the more data you feed it, the more accurate it becomes, the more objective your determination is based on a subjective criteria of what good means.
It's clear there's a lot of people working on some amazing data sets and processing those, but let's imagine the next round of founders. What would you build on top of something like this? How would you start on it? Because it seems like it used to be about, well, what API can I plug in where and what UI can I slap on it? But now it's a whole new cognitive framework you got to start with. So what would you do with this kind of workforce analytics as the base now?
I'll answer that. Let's start with another question that I think is funny because I get this question a decent amount. And I think there's also another thing to be concerned about, which is once you build something good, and especially if you build it on top of one of these large OpenAI LLMs or even the Google LLMs or Anthropic, like whoever you want to talk about, you're at a risk for you can only be so good until they see you're good. They patch the next version and then they've completely cannibalized your business. And ChatGPT did that so well. You've seen all the different ChatGPT versions. What most people don't know is a lot of them are driven by and they don't even go and acquire it. They just re-update the technology to be able to incorporate that use case. So back to your question earlier too about how do you compete against these big guys? I think you need to have extremely strong point solutions. You need to really really own what it is you do and narrow your scope enough to where there's no way ChatGPT is going to go to your local farm or OpenAI is going to go to your local farmers market and collect the data necessary to inform your farmers market's point solution of the best stand out there. You're going to do that though, and that will prevent them from doing it. Got a little sidetracked there, but I think that's a concern you have to think about as you develop these solutions is once they get really good, they'll just be replicated by the underlying company that powers the tech. In terms of what I would be building, again, I think the most successful application of it right now is in data cleaning and data structuring. And so I think if you went to a lot of businesses, small businesses, and just said, listen, I will clean and structure your data. So it's expensive. And so I would actually pool together a lot of businesses. I actually had this idea the other day. Go to like 100 of your local grocery stores because they've got a lot of really cool data about the inflow and outflow of produce and different things like that, and say, I want to put you guys all together and I want to create you a very powerful infrastructure management tool based on your data. It's going to predict when fruit is going to go bad. It's going to do all that stuff. And we're going to go all together in this. And then I'm going to clean and structure that data for you. And then they pay me a subscription amount to be a part of this tool. And I actually think that tool would work really well if you kind of coalitioned 100 grocery stores, and now you could tell them when produce is going to go bad or not bad, or when a consumable is going to sell or not sell. And yeah, and that's pretty hard for a big company like that to copy. It's a very specific point solution.
So it seems like the point solution space is where to go. And it seems like it's still competitive, but nonetheless some cool opportunities. Now, if we look at the top of the food chain, there's a brewing battle between the Salesforces, the Googles, the Microsofts to be that agent of record, the one that spawns all these tools for you. What do you see happening at the top there? Who's going to be the one to unlock the corporate data sets?
Man, I wish I know too. We use Google a lot. We're a big fan of the GCP suite. We work very closely with a lot of their key stakeholders in BigQuery. We're also familiar with the Elasticsearch team and have worked closely with some of their key stakeholders. And I like the way that the Google suite integrates with other search-related products. I don't necessarily have an answer on that one. There is a poaching going on, and you're seeing this a lot of people who are very good at this and who are advancing the frontier very well. And they're kind of getting poached from all different places and going all different other places.
It seems like there's not enough space for all of them at the same time because they're all trying to own the same area. But looking at the solutions that are out in market right now, what are some tools that you're excited about, ones that you're blown away that they're doing this type of work right now? It could be small guys, big guys. What's exciting you?
Yeah, there's a couple different companies. From the big guy side, again, we're fans of the GCP suite. So we like BigQuery a lot. We like what Elastic's doing at Elasticsearch. There's a small guy that I've gotten to know called Terzo. It's a really cool AI firm that digests your financial information and then can do a lot of your vendor management. What I think is cool is that there's a lot of loss of value in contracts. And I actually had a mentor once who told me that the differentiator is he just read the contract. He wasn't even a lawyer. No one really you kind of just send your contract to your lawyer and then your lawyer takes a shot at it. No one actually really reads it. And I think it's intimidating, right? It's intimidating to interact with a contract because it speaks a language that you're not necessarily familiar with. And there's a lot of fine points in there. And so they're a company that actually helps large businesses digest these contracts and see if there's opportunities for vendors and different things within these contracts. Speaking even to small businesses, though, I think there really is a cool opportunity there to feed, and you can do this with ChatGPT, feed contracts to and you can use it with Terzo too, but feed contracts to an LLM and then ask it questions. Like I'm really interested in the documents as a service business, documents that talk to you. I think the opportunity is where there's inefficiency, and there's inefficiency because it's intimidating. And so if you had an ability to interact with these documents in a way that wasn't so intimidating, you might actually reduce a lot of that inefficiency, be able to really take advantage of them.
A lot of the people listening are new to coding. They felt like they've been excluded by this world, but obviously there's a lot of buzz about vibe coding and no code and all this. How would you recommend these sorts of people get started in this world and take advantage of what's happening?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I do think it's a really good application of, it's unsurprising, right? The tech people built a solution that's really good for the tech people. It is a really good application of the technology in helping people who have no coding background get started and actually build things. What I would say is that you can go and ask most of these providers, produce me code that will do X action. That code isn't necessarily without a doubt, will not be the best code you've ever seen. But it is a great starting place, especially as we talk about kind of that democratization of education. And there's so much you can learn from this that you can get to a junior to intermediate level of coding just based on that. Now, in terms of taking it to that expert level and really being a force in it, there are some skill set requirements you need outside of just interacting with a chat agent. But for sure, to get to that like junior level where you start to feel comfortable with it, just interact with the tool and ask it questions, and it'll go pretty far.
And if people want to learn more about your business and yourself, kinds of projects you're working on, where would you suggest that they go to?
Yeah, we've got a website for FORE We kind of post what we're up to. We post some of our case studies. My LinkedIn, Tyler Hochman. I'd say those two places are probably the best place for information.
This episode was hosted by Arpi Dragfigueredo, founder and principal strategist of PH1 Research, and Brittany Hobbs, VP Insights at Huge. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. It's designofai.substack.com.